Trends rise loudly and disappear quietly, yet most people move through life without ever questioning why they feel compelled to follow what everyone else is doing, wearing, buying, repeating, or believing. And before they realize it, their choices are no longer their own, but echoes of the crowd. However, psychology shows that there exists a distinct group of people who rarely, if ever, join trends. And this behavior is not rooted in stubbornness, arrogance, or rebellion, but in how their minds process validation, identity, and social information at a deeper level. Because when someone does not chase trends, it usually means their sense of direction comes from within, rather than from outside approval. And psychological research consistently shows that people who rely on internal validation do not depend on likes, applause, attention, or social confirmation to feel secure in who they are. They measure their decisions against personal standards instead of public reaction. And because of this internal compass, trends simply do not hold power over them. Not because they reject society, but because their confidence is self-generated, not borrowed. And when your sense of worth is stable internally, the emotional pull of what is popular weakens significantly, which is why trend-resistant individuals rarely feel anxious about missing out or being left behind. They are not driven by the crowd's rhythm, but by their own reasoning. Psychology also reveals that people who avoid trends tend to think independently, meaning they process information more deeply and deliberately, rather than reacting impulsively to what is trending at the moment. Instead of asking whether something is popular or socially rewarded, they instinctively ask whether it makes sense, whether it aligns with their values, and whether it serves a real purpose. And this cognitive habit is strongly associated with higher critical thinking ability, because independent thinkers do not outsource their judgment to collective opinion. They analyze, compare, and reflect before accepting ideas, behaviors, or beliefs, which is why they are less susceptible to viral narratives, mass hysteria, or sudden cultural shifts, not because they are immune to influence, but because influence must pass through reasoning before it is accepted. And psychology calls this a deeper level of cognitive autonomy, where thought is guided by logic rather than imitation. Another defining psychological trait of people who never join trends is their reduced sensitivity to social pressure, because most trends do not spread through usefulness or truth, but through fear, specifically the fear of exclusion, embarrassment, or being seen as outdated. And psychology refers to this force as normative social influence, which pushes individuals to conform in order to belong. Yet people who resist trends experience this pressure less intensely, not because they lack social awareness, but because belonging is not their primary motivator. They are comfortable standing alone if necessary, and they do not interpret difference as danger. This emotional independence allows them to tolerate disapproval or misunderstanding without feeling threatened. And as a result, trends that rely on collective participation lose their persuasive strength over them. Psychology also shows that trend-independent people consistently value function over image, meaning they prioritize usefulness, comfort, depth, and long-term value over appearance and attention. While trends are often driven by visibility, novelty, and short-lived excitement, people who resist them think in terms of durability, practicality, and personal relevance. And this mindset is strongly linked to long-term thinking rather than short-term social reward. Because when someone is focused on what actually improves their life instead of how their life looks to others, trends appear unnecessary or even distracting. And this functional orientation explains why such individuals are less drawn to performative behaviors, flashy lifestyles, or constant reinvention. They do not need to prove relevance through consumption or imitation, because their sense of purpose is already grounded. A particularly important psychological factor behind trend resistance is a stable sense of identity, because when someone truly knows who they are, they do not need external symbols to define them. Psychology shows that individuals with a strong self-concept are far less likely to copy others, since they already possess clarity about their values, preferences, and direction. And this clarity acts as a filter that blocks unnecessary influences. Which is why trend-resistant people do not feel lost when trends change. They do not need to reinvent themselves every season to feel valid. Their identity is not fragile or dependent on cultural momentum. It is consistent, internal, and resilient, and this stability allows them to move through changing environments without constantly adapting their personality to match the moment. Another overlooked but powerful psychological trait of people who avoid trends is their ability to protect their mental energy, because keeping up with trends requires continuous attention, comparison, and emotional investment. It demands that individuals monitor what others are doing, evaluate their own position relative to the group, and adjust accordingly, which consumes cognitive resources. However, trend-resistant people are selective with where they place their attention. They invest their energy into things that matter deeply to them rather than what is temporarily popular. And psychology shows that this selectivity is associated with better emotional regulation, reduced anxiety, and higher life satisfaction. Because when mental energy is not constantly drained by comparison, the mind has more space for focus, creativity, and meaningful engagement. And this is why people who ignore trends often appear calmer, more grounded, and less reactive to social noise. It is also important to understand that trend resistance does not mean isolation or disconnection. Psychologically speaking, many trend-resistant individuals still enjoy social interaction, culture, and community, but they engage selectively rather than automatically. They choose participation rather than surrender to it. And this distinction is critical because autonomy does not require withdrawal, it requires choice. And people who never join trends exercise choice consistently, even when conformity would be easier, more rewarded, or less questioned. And this ability to choose rather than follow is a sign of psychological maturity rather than defiance. Over time, psychology shows that people who resist trends often develop stronger self-trust, because every decision they make reinforces the belief that they can rely on their own judgment. And this self-trust compounds, leading to greater confidence, clearer boundaries, and less emotional dependence on external validation, which further reduces the influence of trends, creating a reinforcing cycle of autonomy, clarity, and inner stability. In contrast, those who constantly chase trends often experience identity fatigue, emotional exhaustion, and a lingering sense of emptiness once the excitement fades, because borrowed meaning never lasts, but internally generated meaning does. Ultimately, the psychology of people who never join trends reveals something profound about human behavior. It shows that freedom does not come from rejecting society, but from understanding oneself deeply enough to move through society without being controlled by it. And in a world that constantly tells people what to want, how to look, and who to be, choosing not to follow trends is not passive. It is an active psychological stance rooted in awareness, self-definition, and mental discipline. And this is why trend-resistant individuals often appear quietly confident, emotionally steady, and mentally independent, not because they are trying to stand out, but because they are not trying to fit in at all. If you appreciate psychology content that breaks down real human behavior with clarity, depth, and honesty, and you want to understand the mind beyond surface-level motivation and hype, subscribe to the Knownsense and turn on notifications so you never miss an insight that helps you think more clearly and live more consciously.